website. My name is Denise Ferkel Adams. I am a registered dietitian and the director of the McDonald Center for Obesity Prevention and Education at Villanova College of Nursing. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take just a minute and tell you a little bit about the McDonald Center for Obesity Prevention and Education. This monthly series of professional webinars is provided by COPE. Villanova is the first college of nursing in the country to have a center devoted to obesity prevention and education. As this slide illustrates, COPE's goals are to provide continuing education on obesity topics for professionals, to partner with other agencies and organizations focused on obesity prevention and education, to participate in research, and also to enhance education of students, professionals, and the community. Today's webinar will be presented by Janet Bondbrill, a nutritionist, author, and American Heart Association Go Red spokesperson. The purpose of today's webinar is to evaluate the latest research and practice recommendations on salt intake that would be useful in working with clients. The learner will be able to cite the prevalence and medical sequelae of hypertension in the U.S. and globally, identify major scientific evidence supporting excess sodium in the diet as a risk factor for hypertension, list 5 evidence-based tips for clients in order to help prevent and treat hypertension. The webinar is approved for 1 CPEU awarded by CDR, ANCC, and ACSM. The CDR learning code is 5260. The activity level is number 2. Neither the webinar planners or the presenter have any conflicts of interest to disclose for this presentation. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Janet Bondbrill. She's a nationally recognized nutrition, health, and fitness expert and published author. Dr. Janet Brill is the director of Nutrition for Fitness Together, the world's largest organization of personal trainers. Dr. Janet specializes in cardiovascular disease and has authored several books on the topic. The most recent is Prevent a Second Heart Attack. She has also authored, which follows the best-selling book, Cholesterol Down. Her next book is titled Blood Pressure Down and will be available in May of 2013. Dr. Janet is dedicated to her field and to the broader goal of educating the public on heart health. She was a member of the 2011 Go Red for Women Executive Leadership Team in Philadelphia. Janet holds a Master's of Science degree in Nutrition and Dietetics from Florida International University, as well as her doctoral degree in Exercise Physiology from the University of Miami. She is a frequent guest expert on local and national television, appearing most often as the nutrition expert for The Balancing Act by Lifetime. A prolific writer with contributions to numerous scientific journals, we are very pleased that Dr. Janet and her family reside in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which is very close to Villanova University. So at this point, I will turn the presentation over to Janet.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Denise. I hope you can hear me and that I'm bringing up my presentation now. So let's hope that it comes up. Okay. Denise, is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, first of all, let me welcome everyone and thank you so much. I also want to thank Villanova and the McDonald Center for Obesity Prevention and Education for having me here today. It's absolutely my pleasure to have this opportunity to share my knowledge with you today on salt, which is a topic that strikes an emotional chord among many people. So hopefully I can help you to shake out some of the facts from fiction today and let us begin with the first slide. I'm going to actually start this webinar by talking about hypertension and and then of course go on to salt and the relationship between salt and hypertension. Most recently, the JNC7, that's the seventh report of the Joint National Committee on Prevention, Detection, Evaluation, Treatment of Blood Pressure, which is actually most recent because the JNC8, which has been nicknamed the JNC Late, is still not out. It was supposed to be released last year and is still in the works. So for now, we will deal with the JNC7 definitions and begin by a normal blood pressure is considered a systolic lower than 120 and a diastolic lower than 80. Prehypertension is systolic 120 to 139 and diastolic 80 to 89. Stage 1, 140 to 159 over 90 to 99. And then finally stage 2, which would be systolic 160 or greater, diastolic 100 or greater. Hypertension is not just a problem in the United States, it is clearly a worldwide epidemic. Many countries, half of the population older than age 60 have hypertension. About 20% of the world's adults are estimated to have high blood pressure, and that is only for the hypertension that's defined as a blood pressure in excess of 140 over 90. If you look at the age the older people get, the more likely they are to have become diagnosed with high blood pressure, so especially in people over than 60. But the takeaway message here is that the fact is that more than 1 billion people worldwide are hypertensive, and that hypertension is the #1 cause of preventable death globally. Hypertension is also known as the silent killer. It's an insidious disease, certainly because there are no symptoms. You can't feel it, you can't see it, and so therefore people don't know that they are sick. So as I said, it's a global problem, but it is a tremendous health burden here in the United States. The most recent stats from the American Heart Association estimate that 78 million adult Americans have high blood pressure, defined as over 140 or over 90, whereas an additional 30% of Americans have the new JNC7 definition of prehypertension. And so these are pretty grim statistics. According to NHANES data from 05-06, we know that of the 78 million or so that have hypertension, that not everyone is aware of their condition. Not everyone is taking medication for one reason or another, and quite a few do not have their hypertension under control, so the fact is that in the United States, the large majority of adult Americans have an unhealthy blood pressure level, which puts them at risk for cardiovascular disease, as well as other diseases we'll talk about. In terms of race, the prevalence of hypertension is increasing among all ethnicities in the United States, but most exceptionally in Black Americans, and here in the United States, hypertension in Black Americans is among the highest in the world and is increasing. So the latest statistics show that the prevalence of high blood pressure in Black adults increased from 36% to 42% and was alarmingly high especially among Black women at 44%. So, and the prevalence is also increasing among white Americans. However, I want you to understand that in the United States, particularly among Black Americans, that hypertension is an unchecked epidemic. In terms of dollars, the most recent estimate is for 2009, and it was estimated that hypertension is costing us a lot of money, direct and indirect cost of about $74 billion. And in terms of projections, by the year 2030, that's a little over 15 years from now, we can expect the cost to increase to an astronomical $343 billion. So the fact is that in the United States, the financial toll of hypertension is simply astronomical. So what happens if you do not control hypertension? So over time, basically high blood pressure is going to affect four end organs. It is responsible for the majority of all strokes, for half of all MIs, heart disease. It is also responsible for hypertensive retinopathy and kidney failure, blindness and kidney failure. So you can think brain, heart, eyes, vision, and kidneys as the incredibly unfortunate end organ result of uncontrolled hypertension. So about 69% of people who have a first heart attack, 77% who have the first stroke, and 74% who have congestive heart failure have high blood pressure. So the takeaway message, which is really incredibly unfortunate, is that this is a horrific disease. However, hypertension is relatively easy to treat, simple to diagnose, and prevent, and inexpensive to treat. So that's at a very important point, which I'm focusing on today, that high blood pressure must be prevented and certainly diagnosed and clearly treated with, and of course I'm talking about lifestyle measures to prevent and treat high blood pressure. A study in 2009 came out by Dene et al., and they looked at data from the National Center for Health Statistics in 2005, and they wanted to know how much each risk factor actually increased the risk of death from each disease. And they found that the two top killers that had effective interventions were smoking and high blood pressure, responsible for the largest number of deaths in the United States. In 2005, there were 2.5 million deaths, and about 400,000 were associated with high blood pressure. So that's the situation with high blood pressure. So now let's kind of move on and talk about salt and how that's interrelated with high blood pressure. And I don't know about you, but I think it's out there when you read all the literature, it's kind of confusing because we talk about salt and sodium in the same sentence as being the same thing, and they're sometimes used interchangeably. And also in the literature, you're going to see milligrams of sodium. You're also going to see grams of salt. So I kind of wanted to clear that up right off the bat, so that to help you to understand the literature out there. And there's a few things you need to remember. First of all, most of the sodium we eat is in the form of salt. Salt is chemically known as sodium chloride, and there are some salts, by the way, that don't contain sodium. So sodium chloride is 40% sodium, 60% chloride. 1 gram of salt has 400 milligrams sodium, 600 milligrams chloride. So what do you need to know? You need to know that most of the sodium we consume is in the form of salt. Sodium is the blood pressure raising part of sodium chloride, so that's what we need to watch out for. But it's, we can use them interchangeably because, as I said, most of the sodium we eat is in the form of salt. The average American eats about 3,400 milligrams sodium, so we're talking milligrams here, which equates to about 9 grams of salt. So that's kind of something you can remember, that we're eating an average of 3,400 milligrams sodium, 9 grams of salt, as opposed to what we should be eating according to American Heart Association, which is 1,500 milligrams or less of sodium, which is about 4 grams of salt. Okay, so we want to go down from 9 to 4 or 5, and certainly from 3,400 to under 2,300, preferably 1,500 milligrams. So if we look at salt and human evolution, we want to understand that for most of human evolution, we survived on a different kind of diet than we are eating today. We survived on a very high potassium, low sodium diet. And so our kidneys became exquisitely sensitive to salt, and we adapted to this low salt diet by enabling our kidneys to hold on to the sodium and to excrete potassium, which worked really well for prehistoric humans. But fast forward to today, where we have an insanely sodium-rich, potassium-poor diet, and the end result is kind of failure of the kidneys to adapt to this new diet. So the end result is basically our kidneys holding on to the sodium, excreting the potassium, and the result is damage to the body and ultimately hypertension. So we need to understand also that the body requires only about 500 milligrams of sodium per day. So the fact is here that for most of our evolution, humans consumed less than a quarter gram of salt per day. The Paleolithic diet provided a massive amount of potassium and a very little amount of sodium per day. Okay, so what are the recommendations by major health organizations? There are two basic ones out there. The most recent dietary guidelines recommend reducing sodium intake to a max of 2,300 milligrams, and again that's about a teaspoon of salt, and to further reduce intake to a max of 1,500 milligrams, which is about 2/3 of a teaspoon of salt, among people age 51 and older, among African Americans, and people with hypertension, diabetes, and chronic kidney disease. So if we look at all those people, lump them all together, we see that's about 70% of Americans. So basically what the dietary guidelines are suggesting is for most Americans to cap it at 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day. The American Heart Association is a little more radical in their approach, and they suggest that all Americans reduce their sodium intake to a max of 1,500 milligrams per day. So the takeaway message is, how are we doing? And as I said before, we are eating about twice the recommended amount of sodium. So again, the average somewhere in most countries outside of the United States is 9 to 12 grams of salt per day, but here in the U.S. we consume about 3,600 milligrams of sodium, which is about 9 grams of salt, which is over twice the recommended limit. So now that we've kind of gotten that housekeeping out of the way, let's move on to the topic at hand, this salt controversy. If you've seen the headlines in the last year or so, there's been much debate in the popular press lately regarding salt, and I think that emotions run really strong when it comes to things we love to hate, such as salt, or things we love to love, which is salt. So let's delve into the three main questions that are swirling around this salt debate and see if we can bring some clarity and answer and sort out some of the fact from the fiction. So the first question would be, is excess salt in the diet responsible for high blood pressure? The second question is, will lowering salt in the diet help prevent and treat hypertension? And then the last question is that I'm going to attempt to answer, is, does a low salt diet actually increase your risk of dying, which has been, believe it or not, in the news lately. So let's begin by talking about harking back to the results of the famed InterSalt study. In the 1980s, researchers measured the amount of sodium excreted over a 24-hour period in urine, which is a very valid measure of salt intake. And they did this numerous times among more than 10,000 adults from 32 different countries. And they found that the average was nearly 4,000 milligrams of sodium per day, but there was a huge range. So from an intake of about estimated at 200 milligrams per day in the Yanomamo people of Brazil to over 10,000 milligrams per day among people in northern Japan. So basically the InterSalt study, which by the way stands for International Study of Sodium, Potassium, and Blood Pressure, which was admittedly an observational study and a cross-sectional assessment of over 10,000 people, found that, or they showed that the greater the salt consumption, the higher the blood pressure and the greater the increase in blood pressure with age, as opposed to 4 countries where the sodium intake was really low, under 1,300 milligrams. All those countries had really low average blood pressures and little or no upward swing in blood pressure with age. So that's the INTERSALT study. What do the big health top dogs among our noted scientists and physicians have to say? And basically the takeaway message is that a high salt diet is believed to be responsible for almost half of all cases of hypertension in the United States. That's a statement by the Institute of Medicine. A recent study by Foreman et al. Concluded that a high sodium diet over the long term can lead to endothelial dysfunction and vascular damage, generating a biological state in which continuance of the high sodium diet may produce hypertension, and it's called a sodium amplification loop. So there is a definite connection physiologically between a high sodium diet and endothelial dysfunction, which is the root cause of hypertension. And finally, the most recent AHA statement said that on average, as dietary salt intake rises, so does blood pressure. The evidence includes results from animals, epidemiological studies, clinical trials, and meta-analyses of trials. To date, 50 randomized trials have been conducted. So the takeaway message here is that there is just an enormous body of sound scientific evidence that clearly documents that excess salt in the diet is a major cause of hypertension. In fact, just as we know that cigarette smoking leads to lung cancer, we can safely say, I personally believe that the evidence backs the conclusion that salt, over the long run, a high salt or sodium intake is going to raise your pressure. So the question that curious minds want to know, including me, is what is the initiating factor? How does actually a high intake of dietary salt lead to hypertension? And this is an excellent, draw your attention to this article by Blaustein et al., and it really explains the latest and the greatest ideas of how this high intake of sodium chloride is related to raising the pathogenesis of salt-dependent hypertension. And basically the takeaway message from this complicated looking picture is that there is 2 ways. One is that the high salt intake is going to increase the concentration of sodium in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is going to lead to an extended increase in the sympathetic nervous system activity, which leads to vasoconstriction and high pressure. Second mechanism is the high salt intake would lead to an increase in a substance called plasma ubiane, which is an adrenocortical hormone, and apparently it's elevated in people or patients with essential hypertension. And what happens is that the kidneys hold on to this sodium, that affects the adrenal cortex, which increases the release of this adrenal cortical hormone called ubiane, which leads to physiologically an increase in angiotensin II, which is the most powerful vasoconstrictor there is, as well as an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, an increase in calcium signaling in the arterial smooth muscle, which actually causes constriction of smooth muscle cells in the arterial wall, so which leads to increased blood pressure, which I find this to be fascinating because I want to know exactly why salt, what the connection is between salt and pressure. I direct your attention to another excellent article published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Andragay et al., and again they looked at these specific mechanisms by which high salt intake leads to arterial constriction and peripheral vascular resistance, and these molecular links between sodium and the high peripheral vascular resistance that results from a long-term consumption of high salt diet. And what's interesting about this, their explanation of the pathogenesis of hypertension is that it's not just the high sodium that contributes to hypertension, but also that combined with a low potassium diet. And if you recall, in the caveman diet, if you will, it was the way that we were adapted to eat is to a low sodium, very high potassium diet. So when we reverse that, we have physiological results, and that's what this study defines. Another study hot off the presses in 2012 in Circulation by Foreman et al. They actually looked at over close to 6,000 normal people with normal blood pressure, men and women. They followed them almost 7 years or so, and they looked at multiple 24-hour urine samples of sodium to assess sodium intake, which, as I said, is the most valid way to assess how much salt you're eating. And they measured urine albumin and serum uric acid, which are both markers of endothelial dysfunction. And what they found was that the higher the salt intake, the higher the biomarkers of endothelial dysfunction, the more likely the people were to develop hypertension. So their conclusion was that a high sodium diet leads to these biological changes that favor the development of hypertension. And Dr. Foreman concluded in the study results that this study adds to the considerable evidence that a diet heavy in salt is closely linked to high blood pressure. So aside from hypertension, which is bad enough, there is a relationship between the amount of sodium or salt that you eat and the harm that it does to your body above and beyond just the blood pressure. So let's talk about some of the proven, scientifically proven effects, harmful effects to the body beyond pressure that salt has. Recently, a study has shown that there is an increase in oxidative stress in the brain that results from a high salt intake, and obviously to the brain's vasculature, which becomes damaged and therefore increases your risk for stroke. Both types. A Japanese study showed this, that there was a significant positive association between sodium and death from both types of stroke, hemorrhagic and ischemic. So not so good for brain health. Salt intake is also a significant and independent predictor of left ventricular hypertrophy. We know that it increases the left ventricular mass. It exerts, salt exerts a hypertrophic effect. The thinking is that salt may sensitize the heart to the hypertrophic stimulus of the pressure load. So, we know also that when we cut the salt in the diet, that the incidence of LVH decreases. We also know that a high salt intake increases your risk for proteinuric kidney disease. There's a direct association between salt and urinary albumin excretion, independent of blood pressure. We also know that when you cut the salt, you decrease the protein in the urine, even better than pharmaceuticals such as ACE inhibitors. We know that it increases, a high salt diet increases your risk of hypercalcemia and kidney stones, urinary stones. We know that it increases the risk of arterial stiffness. We know that a high salt diet increases your risk of osteoporosis and the risk of cognitive decline in the elderly. And finally, increases risk of stomach cancer. So the takeaway message here is that salt has direct harmful effects, or an overload of salt has direct harmful effects to the body above and beyond the effect of salt intake on blood pressure. And we know from animal studies that salt can be harmful to your lab rats. So I call your attention back to Andrew Gay's fabulous study, article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007, and they looked at the effect of both sodium and added mineral mineralocorticoids, which, if you recall, Ubain is a mineralocorticoid. And they looked at that, and they also looked at a high sodium, low potassium diet alone in their lab animals, and this is what they found: a whole bunch of negative side effects. So the kidneys, sodium retention, potassium deficit, heart, myocardial ischemia, of course hypertension, endothelial dysfunction, stroke, insulin resistance, glucose intolerance, etc., etc. So the takeaway message here is that a high sodium or a high sodium, low potassium diet will harm the health if given over time to your lab animal as well as human beings. So in answer to the first question, is excess salt in the diet responsible for hypertension? The answer is yes. The relatively recent, in evolutionary terms, increase in salt intake presents a major challenge to the human physiological systems to excrete this large amount of salt through the kidneys. So the consequence is the gradual rise in blood pressure. And so that is the answer to that question. Moving on to the second question in the great salt debate: will lowering salt or sodium in the diet help prevent and treat hypertension? And we know that the best way to study the relationship between salt intake and blood pressure is to look at what are called dose-response studies, meaning looking at the blood pressure response in human beings to several levels of salt intake. And probably the two key randomized controlled clinical trials, which of course are the gold standard and prove cause and effect, would be the famed DASH diet as well as a TOHP. So let's go through these quickly. The DASH diet, you may have heard of this in the news, especially since it's voted #1 diet by U.S. News. And basically the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, was begun in 1997, where they put 500 government. Dr. Frank Sachs of Harvard School of Public Health, he chaired the committee that designed the diets for these trials. And basically what they did is put people on a DASH diet or a Western diet, and all the meals were prepared in the DASH kitchen, which is a huge plus because then people did not have to mess with cooking their own or trying to survive on a low-salt diet in this country, in our society, which is a tough task, which we'll talk about. But so that was the original study, but then they went on to do the DASH sodium trial, which really tested the effects of 3 different doses: 8 grams, 6 grams, or 4 grams of salt per day in combination with the DASH diet or a Western diet. And what they found, the takeaway message, is that blood pressure, the decline in blood pressure was greatest in the lowest sodium group, or the 4 grams per day group. So the takeaway message that researchers showed in an RCT that the DASH diet significantly lowers blood pressure, and if you cut the sodium in addition to the DASH diet, your pressure is going to drop the most. And then here we have the TOHP trials, the trials of hypertension prevention, and they were conducted. There were actually 2 TOHP studies conducted in the late 80s, early 90s, and they tested lifestyle changes, different lifestyle changes on blood pressure, such as losing weight or taking supplements or cutting sodium. The trials lasted between 18 and 36 months, and they found that blood pressure dropped with sodium reduction. But what's really exciting about this study is that over the long term, they followed up these people that were put on the sodium reduction diets over the long term, and they found that after 10 to 15 years, the low sodium groups were actually 25% less likely to have had an MI or a stroke, or to have died from cardiovascular disease. So here, that's the beauty of this study, is that they showed that sodium reduction lowers blood pressure over the short term and cuts risk of cardiovascular events by 25% over the long term, which is pretty amazing if you ask me. So, and the next one was actually from He McGregor in 2011, where they looked at the relationship between reduction in sodium and the change in systolic pressure. So it's a meta-analysis of modest salt reduction trials in this meta-analysis, and they found that that RCTs 1 month or longer show that salt restriction significantly lowers blood pressure in both hypertensives and in people with normal blood pressure. We also know from a study hot off the presses by Jablonski, just published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology in this last month. It was a randomized clinical trial, and they looked at patients with moderate hypertension, middle-aged patients, and they found that sodium restriction for 4 weeks significantly improved those markers of vascular health, which is very important. So, but basically they put, their average intake was 3,600 milligrams of sodium per day. They dropped it down to 1,200 milligrams, put them on a DASH diet, and they found a dramatic increase in endothelial-dependent dilation via flow-mediated dilation in the brachial artery, which is indicative of vessel health. So basically the takeaway message is that cutting your salt intake by 50% not only will lower your blood pressure a significant amount, but it will improve the endothelial dysfunction that is the hallmark of hypertension. So in answer to the question, will lowering sodium in the diet help prevent and treat hypertension? The answer is clearly yes. The fact is there is strong evidence in the scientific literature to indicate that there is a dose-dependent decrease in blood pressure following sodium reduction, with the greatest declines observed in those with the highest blood pressure. So moving right along to the last question in the great salt debate, we have, does a low sodium intake actually increase the risk of death, which has been all over the news this last year? And that is because of these 2 JAMA studies that came up last year in 2011. And you can see here how low salt diet ups risk of fatal heart attack. This goes against everything we thought. And so that is because two articles appeared last year in JAMA. The one, the Adano study, and the other one is the Stolarz study, and basically both of them came up with conclusions that there was a weak correlation between salt intake and blood pressure, and that low sodium intake is associated with higher cardiovascular disease mortality. And they're saying that in the articles that the low sodium intake actually increases sympathetic nervous system activation, as well as decreases insulin sensitivity and increases renin activity. So the question is, what's up with this? And so there was a firestorm of response by very, very prestigious scientists around the world, saying that, wait a second, not so fast. Okay, there are major limitations to these studies. And so one of the most, I think probably the biggest limitation to these studies was their decision to include a trial that included heart failure patients, which should not have been included because they were on aggressive diuretic treatment and they were being restricted. So of course when you measure their sodium, it's going to be low, but these are very, very sick people. So the point is, and the retort to these JAMA studies was that, number one, it was observational study with serious methodological limitations, and that two, none of the observational studies were actually designed to address this relationship between sodium and cardiovascular disease risk. Few used, as you may have recall that I told you that the 24-hour urine assessment of sodium excretion is the most valid marker of sodium intake. Few used this method, so therefore there was potential for significant underreporting of true sodium intake. And finally, as I mentioned previously, they used high-risk cohorts where the underlying patient illness is clearly going to limit the strength of the inferences that were drawn. So a second set of last year, I mean, this last year was quite the year in terms of studies coming out pro salt, and here was one there were two Cochrane reviews. One said again that cutting down on salt doesn't reduce your chance of dying. So, and here was their claim that cutting down on the amount of salt has no clear benefit in terms of likelihood of dying or experiencing cardiovascular disease. And once again, a firestorm of response from people out there concluding that the Taylor et al. Cochrane review overlooked the trend of consistent reductions in all clinical outcomes with a low-salt diet. And they were so upset that that he and colleagues went and reanalyzed the data, and what they found is that when you combined the data with hypertensives with normotensive, that in fact, yes, there was a significant reduction of cardiovascular events by 20%. So the totality of the evidence, including all of these studies, in the takeaway message is that animal studies, randomized clinical trials, and outcome studies all show the substantial benefits of lowering intake of salt, and that no, in fact, it is not true that the very low sodium, that a low sodium intake is going to increase your risk of death. And here we have another Cochrane review out of Denmark, where they examine the impact of salt on hormones and lipids in people with normal pressure. And what they came away with, again published in the Cochrane review was published in 2011, and their conclusion was that the available evidence did not permit a conclusion as whether low salt diets improved or worsened your health. So once again, back in the journals was intense criticism saying that the study was flawed. Dr. Briss, the medical director for the Center for Disease Control, criticized this study as being small, low event rates, young participants. Walter Willett, the chair at Harvard of Nutrition and the School of Public Health, said, number one, unreliable measurement of sodium intake. Number two, failure to account for key factors that influence sodium intake and heart disease risk, missing incomplete urine data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not so fast. The conclusion was for this Cochrane review, it's disappointingly weak, contributes little to our understanding of salt and disease, dangerous to jump to conclusions, and at a time when cardiovascular disease is the world's leading cause of death and excess dietary sodium has convincingly been shown to be a serious public health hazard, the results of this work should neither change thinking nor practice, and I could not agree more. Well, the SALT Institute, which is an extremely powerful organization, jumped all over the studies in JAMA and have put this up on their website, which I find to be quite appalling. And they put low salt danger zone. A study in JAMA showed a low salt zone where stroke, heart attacks, and deaths are more likely. The government's low salt U.S. dietary guidelines drop Americans right into the middle of that danger zone. And why? Why is the salt industry jumping all over this? Because the business of salt. Salt is known as white gold. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. In 2009 alone, the U.S. had 1.5 million tons of quote, human nutrition salt was sold with a value of over 321 million. The annual global production of salt is about 250 million tons. So you can see here from this, there's an excellent article by McGregor et al. Way back in 2002, which really kind of shows what's going on in terms of salt and business. There's a tremendous amount of profit in salt. The salt is used for other things besides food, but just the food industry segment is going to use salt in, for example, meat products. What will happen is that turkey, that frozen turkey that you buy, has been injected with salt water. And why is that? Because it's going to increase the cost for very cheap cost to the producer. So that's going to increase the weight, obviously. A high salt intake is also favored by the beverage industries because, of course, salt is going to increase your thirst. So you are going to buy more drinks and more alcoholic beverages as well. And then a dependence. Actually, people can actually become addicted to salt because it is a learned type of a learned taste, and we become dependent on salty food, so demand increases. So the bottom line here is that salt is big business. So what about projections? Back to something much more palatable, and that is what would happen if we could actually cut our intake of salt? Would you think that there would be any kind of health benefits over the long run? And there was a very recent study, again hot off the presses, where you have three different statisticians from three different places came together, and their results came together, and they did some calculations. The teams were from UCSF, from Harvard School of Public Health, and from the Simon Fraser University in Canada, and they came to these estimates independently, but found that their results converged. The newest projections from last month, cutting salt by 40% to 2,200 milligrams per day could save close to 1 million lives over the next 10 years, and if your sodium intake were actually to drop to 1,500 milligrams, as many as 1.2 million deaths could be averted. So that's a lot of people, that's a lot of lives. So if we look back at the InterSalt study, again, we look and see what would happen if we could just get people's systolic pressure down a few millimeters. And the answer here is that we could save a lot of lives. And the data here shows that if you drop systolic pressure just 5 millimeters, you would get a 14% reduction in death from stroke and almost a 9% reduction in death from coronary heart disease. So that's a lot for a little. Here is a meta-analysis that assessed the relationship between salt intake and stroke or total cardiovascular disease outcome. And again, it's a meta-analysis and a statistical forecast. And basically, it found that a reduction in sodium intake by half could reduce the rate of stroke by a quarter and cardiovascular disease by 17%. A very recent population-based cohort study called the Northern Manhattan Study found that those people that ate the most salt, over 4,000 milligrams per day of sodium, that would be a quarter of the subjects, had a 2.6-fold increased risk in stroke. So it's prospective data, yes, but it's still very powerful, and you get a 17% increased risk in stroke for each 500 milligrams per day over 1,500 milligrams. So in answer to the last salt debate question, does a low sodium diet increase your risk of dying? And the answer is no. Cutting sodium consumption to reasonably low level is going to decrease your risk of premature death. The idea that lower salt intake increases risk of cardiovascular disease mortality is based on evidence with significant methodological flaws. So now let me give you some take-home advice for you and your patients. You need to know where that salt is hiding, and you can see from this graphic that most of it, the large majority, is going to be either in the processed foods or restaurant foods. According to the CDC, they just weighed in on this, 90% of Americans age 2 and older eat too much sodium. Almost half of the sodium we eat comes from 10 different foods, 10 different types of foods. I call them the salty 10. One would be bread and rolls, and that's because we eat so much bread. It's not that it has that much in it, but it adds up. So my RX to your patients would be to just cut down on that bread or eat the low sodium types. We get a lot of salt from our cold cuts and cured meats. I would suggest mixing the deli meats in favor of either low sodium deli meats or just roast fresh is always better. Pizza, you want to make pizza a special occasion because it's basically salty dough with salty tomato sauce and salty fatty cheese. Poultry, you want to buy the fresh, not the frozen. Soups, definitely cook your own. Sandwiches, cheeseburgers, my suggestion, eat less of them, cook at home. Cheese, savor your cheese, small amounts, strong, highly flavorful cheeses, little bits, That way you can get that nice salt taste and just appreciate that without overloading. Those mixed pasta dishes are also loaded with sodium, and that tomato sauce, please make your own. It's so easy, and that you can flavor it with beautiful herbs and spices, and it tastes great. The mixed dishes, again, cook at home. And finally, which I find interesting, it's at the bottom of the list, is those chips and pretzels. So what you can see here, it's the foods that don't taste healthy, that don't taste salty, are actually contribute to our sodium intake the most. So, and also we can save a lot of money by lowering the salt intake. So help your patients to slash that salt. Type of food matters. Cut back on the salty 10. Where the food comes from matters. 65% of sodium is from processed foods, a quarter from the restaurants. So remember, if you are letting other people, whether it be food companies or chefs, dictate your sodium intake, then you're in trouble. So best to eat at home if you could, and consume more fresh and whole foods, and save that eating out for a special occasion, and learn to compare brands of food. They really do matter in terms of your sodium intake. Again, as I said before, you want to learn to cook at home more. Fresh whole foods, those high potassium, low sodium foods, and you want to season foods with herbs and spices, lemon juice, olive oil, vinegar, etc. And here is a recipe from my new book, and my point is that you can still enjoy the good things in life and eat really delicious food. And notice that my chocolate here is contains 0 sodium, and it sure tastes good. So, oh, by the way, you may have heard about the National Salt Reduction Initiative by my favorite mayor, Bloomberg, who has led this partnership of cities, states, and National Health Organization to try and get the restaurants to listen and the food companies to listen and cut back on the sodium. I do love New York, my hometown. So in summary, 1 in 3 Americans has hypertension, and about another third have prehypertension. This is an epidemic, and it places a huge burden on our healthcare system and economy. Estimated $74 billion or so for 2009 alone. Experimental, epidemiological, migration, intervention studies all have shown a causal relationship between habitual dietary salt intake and blood pressure. 9 out of 10 Americans will go on to develop hypertension in their lifetime, making us all truly salt sensitive. Population-based intervention studies and meta-analyses of RCTs have shown that it is possible to achieve significant reductions in blood pressure with reduced salt intake in both hypertensive and normotensive individuals. And I say to you today, this is a call to action for all of us, the public and the health professionals alike, the government and industry, to cut that sodium consumption. Food for thought. Food companies and chefs are dictating your sodium intake. It is the processed foods. We must get a handle on this. We need some laws in there and cut back on the sodium. I don't know about you, but I don't want him dictating how much salt I eat. By the way, what's on the menu when you go out there? Sodium. This bloomin' onion contains 5,510 milligrams of sodium. You would have to eat 5,510 apples to get the amount of sodium in one blooming onion, and that's just the appetizer. So in conclusion, I direct you to these ancient words of wisdom 5,000 years ago. Hence, if too much salt is used for food, the pulse hardens. That's from the Yellow Emperor's classic on internal medicine. I thank you very much, and I am now open for questions.
Okay, Janet. Well, thank you so much for that dynamic presentation. We will be assembling those questions by, let me make sure I take this over. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. As we are reviewing the questions right now. Okay, so now we're back to my screen. Before we get to the questions, I just want to make a quick announcement regarding evaluations and the CE certificates. Everyone who has completed the webinar will be emailed a link to the evaluation within 2 business days. The email will be sent to the email address that you used to register for the webinar. Once the evaluation is completed, the CE certificate will be emailed separately within 2 business days. And again, just a quick reminder for our center, we have an exciting conference coming up on March 15th, a workshop featuring how to sharpen your social media skills with Jim Spellos. He's a very dynamic speaker, has presented at the Florida Dietetic Association and has received national awards for his speaking ability to make you user-friendly with social media. And on March 16th, we're very pleased to feature University of Virginia's Children's Hospital team on best of practice and communication ideas to work with families, and Dr. Ben Gerson on sleep apnea. And actually, I will be leading the session on long-term weight loss keys. And so at this point, we're going to get to some of those questions. So Janet, the first question is sea salt or kosher salt healthier than table salt?
Well, that's a great question because I think the public is very confused with this. They, for some reason, think that sea salt is healthier and is actually a health food. And in fact, by weight, all 3, kosher, sea salt, and table salt, contain the same amount of sodium. I guess the point is that the sea and kosher salt have coarser grains, which means that it contains less sodium by volume. In other words, a teaspoon of kosher salt is going to yield slightly less sodium than a teaspoon of table salt, but not much. So like table salt has about 590 milligrams of sodium per quarter teaspoon, whereas sea salt has anywhere between 400 and 590 milligrams. So you could actually be getting the same amount. So the fact is that these larger coarser salt grain varieties may contain slightly less sodium per teaspoon, but still pack a huge sodium wallop, so they are far from health foods.
Okay, and we did have an interesting question come in asking, diets are liberalized in long-term care facilities and seldom are less than 4 grams per day. Can you address the use of low-sodium diets in the elderly population?
I think that we can all benefit from a low-sodium diet, and I think that that it all lies in terms of palatability in the talent of the chef. And so I think that it's unfortunate that that so much salt is put into the diets of the elderly, and I think that that's because salt is very cheap and it makes inexpensive food palatable. So I think that we need to get the salt out of the diets of the elderly as well as every American's diet.
Okay. We also had a few questions come in around those adults who may be salt sensitive. Should they still be watching their intake?
Of course. Salt sensitive is defined as an immediate blood pressure rise upon eating salt. So I don't know if I actually question whether the validity of using the term salt sensitivity, because over time we are all sensitive to a high salt diet. It's harmful. So I think that it doesn't matter whether a person is immediately sensitive to the salt or not, that everyone should be cutting back on their salt intake because it's not healthy.
Okay. A couple of questions came in regarding how to handle particular questions from their patients, such as if people ask them, can they just drink more water if they eat a high salt diet that day?
And my answer is to do what you can to not eat a high salt diet. If you do eat a high salt meal, then you want to kind of savor your salt and cut back on and eat very, very low sodium the rest of the day. I don't think that drinking a whole bunch of water is going to really fix the fact that you just ate 5,000 milligrams of sodium in your fast food meal.
Okay, and also a question, should we be concerned about feeding salt to babies and small children?
Absolutely. You know that babies are born, they don't like the taste of salt. it's actually a learned taste, and it's really quite sad because we're actually programming them early in life to have this preference for salt. And a recent study published in Pediatric found that our young kids are consuming as much salt as adults, which puts them at high risk for hypertension. In fact, the kids with the highest salt intake, who were also overweight, had 3 times the risk of high blood pressure. So this is a very, very serious situation, and we should not be feeding salt to our babies, God forbid, or and certainly not to small children.
Okay, and with that last question, we are out of time, but I want to thank you, Janet, for a very dynamic presentation. It was very informative, and also for our participants, if we did not answer your question, I will be forwarding them to Janet so that she can respond to you directly. I'd also like to announce that you will, if you attended today's webinar, you will receive an announcement in the near future regarding our March webinar. We are featuring Alyssa Jacobs-Cruz. She's the manager for health improvement programs at Pitney Bowes. And if you're not familiar with Pitney Bowes, they have been a leader in worksite wellness for over 20 years. And her topic will be weight management at the worksite and interprofessional approach. I thank you all for joining us today, and please do visit our website, villanova.edu/COPE, for other additional upcoming conferences and webinars. Be sure to complete that evaluation and let us know topics and ideas for future speakers. Thank you again, and have a very healthy day. And with this, I'll be closing the webinar.